Welcome all viewers to our channel. We are glad to see you here, where we share amazing stories from people's lives. Each of you is important to us and we will be interested to know what country and city you are from. Please write about it in the comments. Now let's get to our story. Autumn had barely touched the small town of Mapletown, painting the parks and streets in warm shades of ochre and bronze. It seemed every leaf, every ray of fall sunshine tried to dampen the cold flood of events that would soon descend upon the town. On this day, 12-year-old Jaden Lowry's life was to be filled with joy. He had finally saved enough money to hold a fundraiser in the town's central square. Jaden, sitting in a wheelchair with a bright blue ribbon on the back, was proud that he could not just wait for help, but raise money for his treatment. He was spreading out small cards that read "Support Jaden" on a folding table, and next to him was a clear box decorated with colorful ribbons that already contained several bills. His smile lit up the square brighter than the fall sun. But on this day, the fall sun will bring no warmth, and his life will change in one cruel moment. The square was filled with the usual noise of the morning rush. People went to work, bought coffee, and hurried about their business. Jaden handed out flyers, talking about his illness, about the surgery that might help him. He believed people would support him. Many smiled, put a few bills in the box, and wished him luck, but a shadow was already looming behind him. Lieutenant Steve Carter, a tall blond man with an icy stare, patrolled the neighborhood he called his own. He was known for his stern reputation, always looking at the world with suspicion, especially if he saw anyone who didn't fit his idea of decency in front of him. When he noticed Jaden, his face contorted. He thought the little black boy was attracting too much attention, and he quickly concluded that he was not just loitering in the square. Carter approached, his heavy footsteps sounding like the beating of Jaden's heart, who noticed the cop only at the last moment. When he stood in front of the boy, it seemed for a second that he just wanted to know what he was doing, but instead Carter leaned closer, his gaze cold as steel. "What are you doing here?" he asked sharply, looking at Jaden with suspicion. The boy, confused, tried to explain that he was holding a charity fundraiser, but the words stuck in his throat, and Carter continued without waiting for an answer. "You don't belong here. Get out of here before you get in trouble." The policeman's voice was loud, and some passers-by began to turn around. Jaden felt a wave of fear flood over him. He didn't have time to say anything in response. Carter, having sharply assessed him as a potential intruder, left him no chance. In the next instant, the policeman stepped back and then, stepping into the boy's personal space, kicked him sharply in the wheelchair, knocking it off its seat. Jaden flew to the ground, hitting the pavement. The money box toppled over, and bills flew around, settling like leaves around the fallen boy. The passers-by froze in horror. No one could believe what had just happened. Some pulled out their phones, recording the incident, while others looked away in fear, afraid of interference. Jaden lay on the cold pavement, feeling his world crumble. Pain pierced his entire body, but his heart hurt the most. This moment would change everything. Jaden, who believed in justice and the help of others, now realized how cruel the world was and how easy it was to break dreams with a single move. The sounds of sirens and deafening silence filled the square after Officer Carter had tossed Jaden aside like he was just trash. At first everything seemed unreal, as if in slow motion. People stood stunned, unable to understand how such a brutal act could have happened in a small, peaceful town. A boy in a wheelchair was on the ground, just smiling and talking about hope for the future. Officer Carter didn't stop even as the phone cameras began to flash around him. Gritting his teeth, he still looked at Jaden with cold contempt, as if the boy were his enemy. To Carter, a boy in a wheelchair, a black man, loud about his needs, attracting attention in his neighborhood, was a potential threat, not a child in need of help. Witnesses ran up to help Jaden up. A girl with long brown hair leaned over him, holding his hand. "Are you okay?" she asked in a shaky voice, trying not to give away her horror. Jaden tried to look up, but his face was contorted with pain and his lower lip was beginning to bleed. He wanted to answer, to say it was okay, but he couldn't utter a word. The words stuck in his throat, mixed with pain and humiliation. Carter, seeing the growing crowd and cameras around him, began shouting orders as if trying to convince everyone he was right. "Disperse. This is a police operation." This guy was seen carrying suspicious items. His voice sounded harsh, almost like a threat, but not grounded in facts. Suddenly someone in the crowd shouted, "You just hit him. He was only collecting money from medical treatment. A voice filled with rage and despair rang through the square, fueling the emotions of the others. People began to shout back, outraged at the police officer's action, but Carter didn't give up. He seemed to revel in the attention and became even more convinced that he was right. Meanwhile, Jaden remained on the ground, next to the overturned stroller, like a lost shard of everything he once thought was fair and just. His clear donation box had cracked open, and bills were lying under his feet like a mockery of his hopes. Tears welled up in his eyes. He couldn't hide the pain and humiliation that pierced him to the core. Some passers-by have already started taking videos, quickly realizing that this moment should not go unpunished. "This is unacceptable. He's just a kid." Exclamations were heard from the crowd. One man with a loud voice shouted in Carter's direction, "You will be held accountable for this." But Officer Carter only grinned, paying no attention to the protesters. He continued to stand, as if enjoying his power over the situation. "You shouldn't have come here if you don't want trouble," he muttered, looking down at Jaden, whose little world had crumbled. The video, shot by eyewitnesses, instantly began to spread across social media. The footage showed Carter walking up to the boy, knocking him off his stroller and staring coldly as he lay on the pavement. Carter's voice, his cruel stare, Jaden's trembling, all of it became the epitome of injustice. Within hours, the video went viral. People from different cities began commenting and sharing it, outraged that a child in a wheelchair had been abused simply because he was perceived as a threat because of the color of his skin. The wave of anger spread across social media, and every comment, every reposted video became part of a collective cry for justice. In the meantime, Jaden had been taken to the hospital. Lying in the room with a bandaged arm and abrasions on his face, he realized for the first time how fragile and unfair the world could be, even for those who tried to keep faith in the good. His mother, Alice, held his hand tightly, tears rolling down her cheeks. She knew the struggle was just beginning. This incident hadn't just destroyed her son, it had broken the heart of the community itself. The video of Officer Carter roughly knocking 12-year-old Jaden out of his wheelchair went viral on social media like wildfire, going from a single cell phone to millions of screens in a matter of hours. Every second of the video was full of senseless cruelty. The cold, indifferent stare of the officer, the boy lying helplessly on the pavement, the scattered bills he had collected for his treatment. On the internet and in the streets, the video sparked anger that turned into a public outcry for justice. The first comment under the video was brief but poignant: "How can our child live in such a society?" Then thousands of other comments followed, full of outrage, tears and hatred. The posts multiplied at the speed of light. Each user considered it his duty to express his opinion. Where's justice? This question grew louder and louder, turning the internet into a chaotic but inexorable movement calling for accountability. Public figures, well-known activists and human rights activists immediately drew attention to the incident. Human rights organizations began preparing for mass rallies, demanding an independent investigation and harsh punishment for Carter. Journalists from the largest media outlets traveled to Mapletown, filming reports against the backdrop of the city's fall streets, which seemed already saturated with tension and anger. The faces of the locals were full of concern, and one thought was in their eyes: how could this happen here in our quiet town? It had only been a few days and the streets of Mapletown were crowded with people dressed in black to mourn and protest injustice. Placards reading "Justice for Jaden," "No Police Brutality," and "Our Lives Matter" rose above the crowd that slowly walked toward the local police department building. Some lit candles, while others carried flowers and stuffed toys, symbols to remind them of Jaden's innocence, shattered in one blow. The crowd gathered in front of the police headquarters was extremely heated. People were shouting slogans, demanding answers from the police and not allowing their anger to subside. It seemed that in every shout, in every movement, people put their pain and frustration. Jaden's mother, Alice, stood in the front row, clutching her son's photograph tightly. Her face was silent, but her eyes said more than words could: a grief that could not be forgotten and a determination to fight to the end. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the police department was tense. The chief of police, surrounded by his subordinates, studied what was happening on the monitor screen. He knew the situation was spiraling out of control, but instead of admitting mistakes or offering a formal apology, authorities stood up for Carter, saying his actions were justified for security reasons. The department's statements only fueled the fire, and the cries of the crowd grew louder and louder, growing into a unified voice demanding justice. By evening, as darkness enveloped the city, the crowd continued to stand outside the police building. Suddenly, one of the protesters shouted, "Who will protect us from those who are supposed to protect us?" These words, reflecting the pain of an entire generation, echoed in the hearts of those gathered. The police put up a cordon in front of the building, seeing in the crowd not people worried about their safety, but enemies trying to undermine their authority. Anxiety turned to rage, and the first clash occurred when one of the protesters, trying to get closer, was hit with a baton. It was the catalyst that blew everything up. Chaos ensued, the sounds of shattering glass, screams and groans blended into a nightmarish cacophony that echoed in every corner of the city. Television cameras captured protesters retreating and throwing plastic bottles and pieces of garbage at the police, while police responded with tear gas, further inflaming the situation. Journalists broadcast live. Little Mapletown was now a battleground between justice and violence, between power and pain. The town seemed to be tearing itself apart, all because of one unjust blow that turned out to be just the tip of the iceberg. By morning, when the tired protesters began to disperse, only a heavy silence remained, but the determination to continue the struggle burned in their hearts. This was only the first step in their journey towards justice. Every time Alice opened her phone, the screen exploded with messages, notifications, and mentions. The internet, which at one point had become her means of fighting for justice, had become a horrible labyrinth filled with anger, judgment, and threats. Everything that was happening seemed like some crazy dream, a nightmare from which she could not wake up. She knew that the incident with her son had caused a wave of public anger, but she hadn't expected her family to be at the center of this storm, and she didn't understand why people thought they had the right to judge her. Alice worked as a nurse at the local hospital. Alice had no time to think during her shifts. She helped patients, treated, comforted, and tried to forget the horror of what had happened to Jaden. But as soon as she got home, reality came crashing back down on her. Social media, television, radio, everywhere the case was discussed, and in the comments she was called a heroine or a bad mother. That evening when she got home from her shift, her hands were shaking with fatigue and tension. She tossed the medical bag on the kitchen table and turned on her phone. Another notification flashed on the screen. Will a mother who cares for her son let him sit alone outside? Read the comment. It was followed by another. What are you even thinking when you let such a child out in the square? Obviously, he is attracting unnecessary attention. Those words pierced her like a knife. Alice tried not to read the comments, but she still clung to each one, as if hoping to find support, a little sympathy. She realized that no person, no mother, deserved such condemnation when her child was attacked, but the guilt grew with each comment she read. She felt that under the gaze of the judgmental crowd, she should have been flawless, never wrong about anything, only making perfect decisions. But she was an ordinary woman, an ordinary mother who had neither the energy nor the time to control everything. "It was my fault," she whispered quietly, clutching the phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Tears filled her eyes, but she held them back. Too many tears had already been shed. Alice felt that if she let herself cry again, she wouldn't be able to stop. Meanwhile, the neighbors began to distance themselves from her family. Her co-workers at work looked away, and even some of the parents of Jaden's school friends stopped calling. It was like a quiet denial, as if she or her son had suddenly become something dangerous, unwanted. One evening, as she and Jaden were returning home from his visit to the psychologist, they found a small note on her porch, left by someone from the neighborhood. It was written in scrawled handwriting, "Your mistake, your punishment, leave us alone and get out of here." Alice felt the ground slipping from under her feet. This town had always been her home. She'd grown up here, gone to school here, worked at the local hospital. Her son was also born here, and she dreamed of him growing up in this small town where everyone knew each other, safe and secure. But now this house had become a trap for her. She couldn't feel safe anymore. Alice sat in the kitchen at night, wondering how to protect Jaden. He had already lost too much: his health, his trust in people, his childhood belief that the world was good and fair, and now he had to see his own mother judged and blamed. She tried to shield him from these conversations, from the comments in the news, but Jaden understood. Though he remained silent, he grew quieter, darker, as if he knew that his mother now bore too great a burden for him. Once Jaden, gathering his wits, asked quietly, "Mom, do you, regret that I was there?" Alice looked at him with horror. Her heart sank. The words hit her as painfully as if someone had torn the last of her strength from her. "No, baby," she whispered, taking his hand. "It's not your fault. Nothing. It's not your fault, and no one has the right to make you guilty." But she realized that her words wouldn't take the weight off his small shoulders. Jaden saw everything, knew everything. He saw the way his mom struggled to hold on, the way her tears rolled down her cheeks when she thought he was asleep. He didn't need to know the details to feel the guilt that weighed on her. Alice knew that the fight now would be much harder than just getting Officer Carter punished. She had to deal with the pain within herself, the judgment of society, and most importantly, she had to keep Jaden's faith in himself and the people around him. She couldn't let the world that broke her boy break her as well. It has been a few days since the video went viral all over the internet, sparking a storm of outrage, and people started taking to the streets. In an unexpected turn of events, however, the police department issued a statement in which leaders strongly sided with Officer Carter. In a document typed in cold, official type and read on local television, the department argued that Carter's actions were reasonable and necessary in the interest of public safety. They cited an alleged heightened threat from increased street gang activity and said the officer had a duty to act promptly and decisively. The statement sounded like a slap in the face to Alice and anyone else who expected even a hint of apology or remorse. The words public safety and reasonable measures seemed like an insult. What could a child in a wheelchair do? What could he do to threaten an armed adult man? But the department didn't seem intent on backing down. Repeating the same phrase, Officer Carter acted in the interest of the safety of all citizens. The next day, Carter's lawyer, George Manning, a confident man with a cold, penetrating gaze who had defended police officers in similar cases, spoke to the media. Manning, clutching the case file in his hands, began to build a defense from the first words. As if this were not an assault on a child but a matter of national importance, he stood behind the pulpit in the courtroom and, straightening his back, addressed the reporters. Officer Carter, like any other officer of the law, is always in a situation where he has to make instant and difficult decisions. On that day, he had to act on available information about a heightened threat on the city streets, Manning said, emphasizing each word as if he wanted to hammer it into the minds of the crowd. There were groups of young men gathering in the square, and among them was this boy, whom Carter mistook for a possible contact. It should not be forgotten that Jaden was alone, and this could have aroused the suspicions of any vigilant officer. Opponents of the prosecution must realize that officers work under constant stress. Mistakes are possible, but that's no reason to turn Carter into a criminal. The lawyer's voice sounded almost solemn, as if he were making a speech before an oath. The local media, most of which supported the police department, immediately picked up on this version of events. Headlines in newspapers and on news websites began to appear along the lines of, "Police officer in dangerous situation forced to act," and "Boy may have been involved in unauthorized activities in the square." Local commentators and bloggers, many of whom had previously expressed support for Jaden, now began to question and switch to objective reporting, insisting that the case deserved further investigation. Alice had heard it on the radio, on TV, read it on her phone. Every word hurt her, but what hurt the most was that now she was afraid to even go outside, where the locals were openly discussing that the kid must have caught the officer's eye. At the grocery store, at the post office, even by the schoolyard, parents of other kids were whispering, and those whispers reached her ears. She felt like she was cornered. Jaden noticed her distress and became withdrawn, lost confidence. He stopped making eye contact with his friends and hid when his mother drove him to school, always thinking about how he was perceived by others. Following the attorney and department statements, those who openly supported Carter began to emerge. Groups sprang up among the city's residents and held meetings to discuss supporting officers in times of need. Slogans in support of Carter began to appear on the walls of buildings, alongside posters supporting Jaden. "Police protect our city. Officers should not have to apologize for doing their job." Alice saw this poster outside the store one day and felt her heart squeeze. It wasn't just a poster, it was a stab in the heart, a reminder that part of her own town, her own community, had sided with the man who had hit her son so mercilessly. Every day she had less and less strength to fight. She felt as if she were fighting alone against an entire city where even her closest friends were suddenly on the other side of the barricades. Alice saw people she'd known for decades start to support Carter, saying he was just protecting order and couldn't possibly know all the circumstances. She was surrounded by looks of judgment and distrust. each look reminding her of how cruel the world could be. Alice closed the doors and windows every night, locking herself and Jaden away from all those people, from the anger and misunderstanding that now surrounded them on all sides. Jaden sat in his room, staring out the window in silence. He was still so young, but he realized that this city was no longer the peaceful place he and his mother had imagined it to be. It wasn't just Mapletown that was shaken up by the events surrounding Jaden. The whole country now knew about the case. Even as the police department tried to justify Officer Carter's actions, the public was not going to stand by silently. The voice against violence and injustice was louder than ever, and soon there were people willing to fight for Jaden and his family to the end. The first to come to the rescue were community leaders, activists and prominent human rights activists who saw in this incident not only the tragedy of one boy, but also a reflection of an entire system of oppression and bias. The day after Carter's attorney spoke, Martin Wilson, a prominent civil rights activist and advocate, came to town. Wilson immediately drew major media attention to the incident, organizing a press conference right outside the police building, drawing a crowd of journalists and people ready to support Jaden's family. Jaden and his mother need more than sympathy, Wilson said to the cameras, his voice firm and unyielding. They need justice and protection from the system that betrayed them. This case is not just about one city, it's about all of us. If we let it go unpunished, then we are complicit in this brutality. After his speech, a series of rallies began, with hundreds of people participating in each one. Placards reading "Justice for Jaden," "Stop the violence," and "The system cannot be above the law," filled the streets. People marched with fiery speeches, with a sense of unity and strength that fueled anger and resentment for Jaden. Now it was not only his peers and neighbors who took to the streets, but also those who had previously remained indifferent. Within days, the protests spread to other cities, and activists and advocates from across the country began traveling to Mapletown to draw attention to the story of the boy and his family. Meanwhile, Jaden and Alice found support in the legal field as well. At Wilson's suggestion, a special fund was organized to help the family cover all of Jaden's medical expenses and provide him with legal protection. At the meeting where the fund was discussed, Martin Wilson made an appeal to the local community. We all see one of our children betrayed and abandoned to his fate. It is our responsibility to help him and his family get through this nightmare. We cannot allow this little boy to be left alone in the face of all the hatred and bureaucracy that turns a blind eye to his suffering. The foundation immediately began fundraising, and soon Alice's accounts were filled with the first contributions from people who cared. Ordinary citizens donated money, families sent letters of support, entrepreneurs and showbiz stars transferred large sums of money to cover all the necessary treatment costs and help Jaden regain his health. Incredibly, within a few days, a huge amount of money was raised, which allowed the family to not only cover the current medical expenses, but also to plan a rehabilitation program for Jaden. At one of the rallies, Alice dared to speak for the first time. Her voice shook, but she stood firmly on the stage, supported by other activists and leaders. She saw the faces of the people who had come here for her and her son and felt the support from all sides. This gave her courage, and Alice began to speak. "I could not have imagined that my family would be in such a position. My son, a little boy who just wanted to live, to raise money for his treatment, was victimized not only by one person, but by the whole system. Thank you for your support. Thank you to everyone who didn't turn away when this happened. We have to do everything we can to make sure Jaden knows he is not alone. We have to make sure that no other child has to go through something like this." Her words caused a storm of applause. People shouted her name, shouted Jaden's name, raised their fists to the sky in solidarity. With each word, she felt her fears and doubts dissipate, giving way to the feeling of strength that the support of others gave her. As the day went on, the number of people coming to support Jaden only grew. Journalists from major publications traveled to Mapletown to cover the events and share the boy's story nationally. Meanwhile, Martin Wilson and his team began preparing a legal attack on the police department, gathering top attorneys to open an investigation and bring Carter to justice. The city now lived by the slogan "Justice for Jaden." The community began to realize that this case was much more than the story of one child. It became a symbol of the struggle against the violence, bias and impunity that Carter epitomized. Several weeks have passed since the incident, and the pressure on the police department has only grown. The public demanded justice, and in response, a formal investigation was announced. led by a team of independent investigators. It was clear from the outset that the investigation would be complex and multi-layered, involving not only the incident itself, but also broader questions about racial bias and police authority. Investigators began analyzing video footage taken by witnesses during the incident. The footage was shocking images of Jaden, defenseless in his wheelchair, contrasted with the image of a powerful police officer who kicked him forcefully without thinking of the consequences. With each viewing, the footage increasingly confirmed the public's discontent, forcing investigators to realize that this was not just an incident, it was a revelation of a systemic problem in the police force. The first thing the investigators decided to do was to interview witnesses. Many of them were shocked at what they had witnessed. Among them was a woman named Laura who, like many, had come to the square to support Jaden in his charity event. She told investigators about how ruthlessly Officer Carter had behaved without giving Jaden and his mom a chance to explain themselves. He just walked up and started yelling without letting them say a word, Laura recalled, her voice shaking with excitement. It was so unfair. I couldn't believe my eyes when he kicked him. I thought my heart was going to burst. Other witnesses shared their impressions as well, and each day more details began to surface. Investigators soon discovered that Officer Carter had a mixed reputation. There were instances in his past where he had used excessive force, and more than once he had been accused of racial bias. Internal police investigations did not result in meaningful consequences, and many people simply tried to avoid mentioning him. Now, however, with the launch of an official investigation, these facts have become too important to ignore. Each new day brought new evidence. The investigative team uncovered surveillance footage that showed Carter's behavior in other situations, his rudeness, inappropriate comments, and aggressive actions towards citizens, many of whom posed no threat. This evidence created an impression of him as a police officer who not only did not know how to manage his aggression, but also showed bias against people of a different race. As investigators began to gather all of these facts, they realized that there was a major problem in the police system. It became apparent to them that Carter's behavior was not an isolated incident, but part of a deeper, more entrenched problem within their ranks. They began to talk about it at police meetings, where police officers, unable to cope with public pressure, began to express their grievances. As the investigation continued, the public did not stand idly by. Support for Jaden and Alice grew. In parallel with the rallies, signature campaigns began to be organized for an independent investigation not only into the incident, but into all cases of police brutality in the city. More and more people realized that this case had become a symbol of something more than just the brutality of a single police officer. Martin Wilson, who coordinated the activists, took the stage again now at larger events where not only specific cases were discussed, but also the need for reform in law enforcement. He had a microphone in his hands and flags with "Justice for All" flapping in the background. He spoke about the need for changes in police practices, the importance of anti-corruption measures, and the protection of citizens' rights. We must fight not just for Jaden, but for all those who have been victimized by systemic injustice, Martin said, his words echoing in unison with the shouts of the crowd. This is not just one city's fight. This is a fight for all cities, for every life that suffers from bias and violence. Meanwhile, internal police investigations began to surface, revealing more and more details from Carter's past. The public demanded that he be suspended from the force pending the outcome of the investigation, and the pressure was so intense that the police department had no choice but to agree. Officials began to speak openly about the need to raise standards of police training, the importance of monitoring police behavior, and professional ethics. These discussions were part of a broad dialogue on law enforcement reform, which has become more relevant than ever in the light of current events. Each new day brought new details, but despite everything, Jaden and his mom continued to stick together, finding support in their community and among activists. They knew they had many struggles ahead of them, but with each step toward justice, they grew stronger and their voices grew louder. The day after the preliminary hearing, the courtroom was full. People came to support Jaden and his mother Alice, including activists, acquaintances, neighbors, and even strangers who simply heard about their story and decided to express their solidarity. On the walls of the courthouse hung posters reading "Justice for Jaden" and "Stop Police Violence." The atmosphere was tense and everyone realized that this case was not just about Jaden, but about the whole system. The prosecutor, a young and driven lawyer named Emily Lewis, opened the case with a powerful statement. She described how Jaden, a 12-year-old boy in a wheelchair, was merely trying to raise money for treatment for a rare disease when his life was drastically changed by Officer Carter's ruthless and aggressive behavior. Amelia demanded not only a guilty plea, but also strict punishment for someone who used his power to traumatize a defenseless child. "This is not just a case of violence," Amelia said, her voice steady. "This is a case about racism, about how the police system, designed to protect, too often becomes a tool of oppression. We are here to prove that such behavior is unacceptable, and that every action must have consequences." The prosecutor's words resonated in the hearts of those present, and there were murmurs of approval and cheers. Amelia continued, presenting the evidence videos of the incident, witness testimony, medical reports of Jaden's injuries and psychological state. Carter's attorney, an experienced defense attorney named Gregor Smith, then took the stand and began his presentation by attempting to soften the situation. He assured the court that the officer was acting under instructions and that his actions were motivated by a sense of threat. "Dear court, Officer Carter is understandable," Smith said, trying to create the image of a victim for his client. He was faced with an unpredictable situation, and in a moment of stress, he made a decision based on his professional training. No one can estimate how difficult it was for him at that moment. Smith raised questions about how an officer might have perceived a situation where a group of people surrounding Jaden looked suspicious, and that he, as a police officer, needed to act quickly to avoid a possible threat. This argument, while weak, found some support among conservative viewers, and some began to quietly agree. But the prosecutor was quick to respond. She presented evidence of Carter's bias, his history of inadequate use of force and racist comments made in the past. Amelia pointed out that Jaden's situation was not an isolated incident, but merely a manifestation of systemic racism that needed to be eradicated. "We cannot allow fear to determine the actions of police officers when the lives of innocent citizens are at stake," she insisted. "We must ask ourselves, how many more of these cases are we willing to accept before we say enough is enough?" The hall filled with loud cheers of support, and people began to rise from their seats. Emily's every word resonated with those who had come to support Jaden and his family, and she could feel the powerful energy of support rising in the air. Over the next few days, witnesses were questioned in court. Every witness who took the stand shared their recollections of the horrific scene they had witnessed, and their words only strengthened the prosecution's case. The prosecutor tried to present every detail to show that Carter's actions were not only cruel, but prejudicial. Martin Wilson, who also chose to speak, called for a deeper discussion about racism and policing. He questioned why officers with such powers are not trained to properly recognize threats and avoid excessive use of force. In his remarks, he talked about how important it is for police to become part of the community, not the enemy. "We need to see what goes on behind the doors of police stations. We have to understand how such bias becomes part of the structure and that it ultimately destroys trust between the police and the community," he said forcefully, addressing the court and those present. With each new detail, the case became more emotional and tensions rose. Each witness spoke of how the incident had affected their lives and how they had witnessed what should have been unacceptable in a civilized society. After weeks of trial, attorneys for both sides began presenting their closing speeches. Prosecutor Amelia urged the judge not only to impose a fair sentence, but also to address the systemic problems that led to the incident. "We are here to set a precedent, to show that this kind of violence is unacceptable and that everyone, regardless of race or social status, deserves to be protected," she concluded, and her words drew applause from the audience. Attorney Smith, for his part, tried to minimize the consequences, citing Officer Carter's psychological state, his right to defend himself, and the fact that anyone can make a mistake in a moment of stress. "He is a man who upholds the law. He never meant any harm," Smith said, but his words seemed increasingly impotent amid the vast public discontent. The courtroom was filled with anticipation as the judge came out to announce the decision. Many hearts sank in anticipation, and despite all the drama surrounding the case, there was a spirit of hope for justice in the air. The judge took a seat, looked at those present, and said, "We now await the decision of the case." As the trial continued, the media wave caused by the incident with Jaden only grew. The entire city, and soon the entire country, followed the developments, covering every detail, every emotion, and every word spoken in court. Reporters, camera crews, and cameras sought to capture every reaction, every witness, and all of this took place against the backdrop of the constant discussion of racism within the police force. The media actively published interviews with activists, community leaders, and even ordinary citizens who shared their views on what had happened. These voices on air reflected a wide range of opinions and emotions, from anger and pain to calls for unity and understanding. Every report, every talk show became an arena for discussing the deep problems rooted in society. Journalists began to investigate the police system, exposing the bias and racial discrimination that existed in various cities across the country. Activists also began organizing rallies and demonstrations in various cities, raising questions about the need for police reform, awareness programs, and mandatory anti-racism courses for law enforcement officers. As journalists searched for facts, events themselves were unfolding rapidly. Each new day brought new revelations, sometimes shocking, about how the system protects its employees. Revealing articles appeared about how Officer Carter had gotten away with his actions more than once before. This only fueled the fire and increased public discontent. Social media has become a battleground. A real war of words unfolded on Twitter and Instagram. The hashtags #JusticeForJaden and #StopPoliceBrutality went viral, and each new post, each new video about the incident attracted more and more attention. Each post sparked heated discussions, with people divided, some defending Officer Carter, pointing to his right to a defense and accusing the activists of manipulation, while others demanded justice and a full investigation. Amidst this tumultuous media environment, Alice, Jaden's mother, was at the center of attention. Her interviews went viral, and her every tear, every word about the pain she felt as a mother became a symbol of the struggle for rights and justice. She talked about how hard it was to see her child suffer not only from the physical trauma, but also from the psychological pressures caused by this tragedy. Alice became more and more vulnerable in front of the cameras, but at the same time her voice became stronger. She realized that her story could be an inspiration to other mothers whose experiences were also full of pain and fear. Her words resonated with thousands of people, and she decided she would not remain silent. In an interview, when asked how she was coping with the aftermath of the incident, Alice said, "I can't let fear and grief take away my ability to fight. We have to change this system. I want my son to live in a world where he will not be afraid of those who are supposed to protect him." At this time, amid public pressure, there was also division among citizens. Some were beginning to voice their discontent and concerns that such incidents were undermining confidence in the police and jeopardizing public safety. These voices were supported by some local politicians who demanded greater toughness in the fight against crime. They argued that support for police action was necessary to ensure order and safety in the city. Every day, demonstrations in support of Jaden were held in front of the court, and each demonstration became more and more crowded. Amidst the protests, the question was raised among Jaden's supporters about the need for tighter control over police actions. Everyone realized that this case could be a turning point for the city, when citizens would have to decide which side they were on. Among the controversies in the community were plans to reform law enforcement agencies. Activists called for the creation of independent commissions to investigate police actions, as well as for training programs for officers that would enable them to deal more effectively with conflict situations. People began to question how a system that is supposed to protect could simultaneously oppress and intimidate. Discussions arose about the need for changes in legislation, about how the face of law enforcement agencies could be changed to make them more accessible and open to the public. At the same time, fears and anger were building. The ongoing discussions made many people feel uncomfortable. In some parts of the city, disputes between supporters and opponents of reforms flared up, sometimes leading to clashes. The society was split apart, with each side insisting on its own opinion. Against this backdrop, Jaden, despite his injuries, remained a symbol of struggle and hope. He continued to receive support from activists, and more people became active in charity events to raise funds for his treatment. Each new event became a platform to discuss issues that went beyond a single case and broaden the horizons of racism and bias in policing. With each new day, the tension in the city grew and the talk of justice became more and more urgent. While the court case continued, citizens realized that this was just the tip of the iceberg, and the real battle for change was just beginning. The public discussion about Officer Carter's actions went beyond the trial. Journalists began to investigate not only the incident itself, but also the personality of the police officer, trying to understand what could have led him to such brutal actions. As if in response to the growing discontent, analyses and interviews with psychologists, sociologists, and law enforcement experts began to appear. An expert on the psychology of violence, Dr. Sophie Green, was one of the first to point out how Carter's own traumas may have affected his perceptions. On one of her talk shows, she stated, "We cannot ignore the fact that many of those who serve in the police force have themselves experienced violence in their childhood or adolescence. It shapes their perception of the world around them. They may begin to see a threat where there is none. This does not justify their actions, but it does provide insight into where such reactive and aggressive responses come from." Dr. Green explained that in many cases, police officers can become broken people where the system sees no need for rehabilitation and help. She raised the importance of not only training police officers in conflict de-escalation techniques, but also providing them with mental health support so that they can deal with their own inner demons. By the time the controversy over how exactly the police training system worked began, the Carter case had already taken on dimensions beyond individual responsibility. In program reports, journalists began to highlight the problems associated with the lack of psychological training and support in the police, as well as the general atmosphere of toxicity that sometimes prevailed in police stations. Many retired former officers began to share their stories of how they had often experienced violence and bias in their environment. They spoke of how stereotypes ingrained in the police prevented an adequate response to stressful situations and led to excessive use of force. "The police should serve the public, not fear them," one witness said when contacted on air. "I have been in the police force for 20 years and I have seen many of my colleagues become a threat themselves instead of protecting people. This is not because of malice, but because of a lack of human approach to our own officers." These revelations filled the airwaves, and some even suggested reforms based on the use of psychological testing and long-term support for police officers. As the public began to realize that Carter's problems may have been deeper than just his personal shortcomings, the discussions became increasingly emotional. At the same time, the controversial speeches began. Some of the officers' defenders insisted that focusing on Carter's traumas and experiences distracted from the real issue, his actions. They argued that despite his personal problems, he still should have known how to handle children and what it was to recognize a threat. This created even more polarization among the town's residents. Amidst this diversity of opinion, Alice, Jaden's mother, has not been left out. In an interview, she openly stated, "I don't care what injuries Carter has. He has damaged my son. He has caused fear in his life. I don't want to hear excuses. I want him to answer for his actions." These words sounded like thunder in the silence. For Alice, this was not just a fight for justice, but a case about the safety of her child's future. She stood on the front lines of the fight against injustice and pressed those who believed that understanding and empathy should be at the center of the debate. Amidst the growing tension, the question that began to arise in the minds of many was, what should be done about the system? Can it change its ways and provide a safer society? Or is it doomed to continue reproducing cases like the Jaden incident? Each new report raised these questions and left viewers in a state of anxiety. Journalists began to explore the deeper roots of the problem. They interviewed activists, researched data on police use of force, and examined evidence about how different cities were dealing with bias and violence. This was not a simple matter. Even within the police system itself, there were diverse opinions about how and what needed to change. In parallel, activists began collecting data on incidents of police violence in different cities, creating a dossier that soon became the basis for a major report on how systemic racism affects the daily lives of citizens, especially those in vulnerable situations. As a result, the question of what is primary, a broken person or a broken system, became central to the discussion. This was not just a fight for Jaden, but a challenge to the entire structure, a call for change in a system that had gone unpunished for too long. With each new day, the answer to this question became more insistent, and no one knew how far this movement would go or what changes might result from this tragedy. But one thing was clear, a new era of the struggle for human rights had begun, and it had escalated to the extreme. The trial was drawing to a close, and the whole community held its breath as it awaited the verdict. In the tense atmosphere of the courtroom, every eye was on the judge as he prepared to announce a decision that would change the lives of many. Over the course of several days, Lawyers for both sides had presented their arguments, and emotions in the courtroom fluctuated between hope and fear. When the judge finally pronounced his verdict, tension hung in the room. "Officer Carter is guilty of abuse of power and bias," he said, and at that moment there were subdued sighs of relief and quiet applause. Alice, Jaden's mother, held back tears. She knew it wasn't complete redemption, but at least it was a step toward justice. However, the sentence came with a condition. The officer received a temporary suspension and mandatory participation in a rehabilitation program that included psychological counseling and anti-racism courses. In addition, the court ordered the police department to pay Jaden's family compensation for moral and physical damages. But despite these steps, a residue remained in the heart of the city. Many citizens began to question whether this was really a step toward justice or just a cosmetic change that did not address the root of the problem. Public debate flared up with renewed vigor, and people demanded deep reforms in policing to prevent similar incidents in the future. Opinion leaders, human rights defenders and activists continued to talk about the need for change beyond the individual case. They raised questions about how police structures could be changed to prevent such incidents from happening again. The community demanded the establishment of independent bodies to investigate police actions, regular psychological testing and training that would prepare police officers to work with vulnerable groups. As the city prepared for more protests, Alice decided to use her platform to promote these ideas. She began organizing rallies and conversations with citizens to share her experiences and call for change. Alice became a symbol of hope and resistance, and her story inspired many to take action. At one such rally, she raised the importance for society to not only seek justice, but to work toward reconciliation. "We shouldn't hate," she said, "but we should strive for understanding and change. I don't want this to happen to anyone else. We have to learn from our mistakes or nothing will change." Meanwhile, Officer Carter, despite his punishment, remained on the verge of isolation. His public scorn was evident, and he faced growing hostility, including from his own colleagues who felt his actions jeopardized their jobs. He was the center of attention and continuous discussion, and many wondered if he would ever recover his name. Psychologists and experts have begun to publicly debate not only Carter's actions, but also deeper questions about what it means to be a police officer in today's society. If police officers can't build trust with the community, they can't fulfill their duties, said one leading researcher. The issue became more and more pressing, and experts called for programs that would foster interaction between police and community members. As the recovery process moved forward, a wave of protests erupted in the city, demanding justice system reform. People took to the streets, demanding not just punishment for those responsible, but a more transparent and accountable structure that would take into account the views and needs of citizens. Despite the successes that Jaden's family faced, they also realized that receiving compensation would not solve all problems. Alice realized that the fight for human rights and the protection of the vulnerable was a long journey, and she was ready to keep going, fighting for her children and for future generations. With each new day, there was a growing realization in the public consciousness that this tragedy was the beginning of a great work that required a willingness to change on the part of all involved. New activists, new ideas emerged, and a desire for constructive dialogue was born in society. Thus, the world of Jaden and his family, as well as the entire city, will never be the same again. Their story became a symbol of the changes that must take place to prevent similar incidents from happening again in the future. Now everyone understood, justice cannot be achieved alone. It requires a united effort, a willingness to listen to each other and a commitment to real change in the system. A few months after the trial, the city began to slowly recover from the deep turmoil caused by the Jaden incident. The streets, once full of anger and protest, gradually filled with active discussion of the changes that were to come. While some remained disillusioned, many began to realize that change was possible if everyone was willing to take responsibility for their participation. New police training programs were launched aimed at eliminating bias and supporting community engagement. The local police department enlisted the help of experts and activists to develop courses focused on empathy, respect, and understanding. These classes included role-playing and simulations that allowed police officers to see the world through the eyes of those in their community. At the same time, the city created initiatives that allowed residents and police officers to meet in a relaxed environment. Open-air events were organized where residents could ask questions of police officers and discuss their concerns. This was an opportunity for police officers to demonstrate their humanity and openness, and to get feedback from residents who were previously afraid of them. For Jaden's family, this period was a new beginning. Alice, determined, continued to advocate for the rights of her son and other vulnerable groups. She organized meetings with local activists, shared her story, and inspired other parents to fight for justice. Jaden, despite his trauma, has become a symbol of hope for many. His strength and courage inspired people, and he even started participating in charity events, raising funds for other children with disabilities. Alice continued to push the importance of education and understanding. She spoke on panel discussions that addressed not only racism in the police, but also broader themes of equality and inclusion. With each presentation, more and more people realized that real change requires effort not only from the police, but from the entire community. Although the struggle was not yet over, it was obvious that the residents began to feel the change. People were becoming more active, joining different movements, and this created a strong momentum for improvement. A new coalition of local groups was formed with the common goal of defending human rights and fighting bias. Their slogans of equality and justice were heard on every corner of the city. One of the most significant moments of this movement was the day Jaden and his family were invited to a local conference to discuss new programs to improve policing. Jaden, sitting in his wheelchair, said to the entire room, "I believe I can change the world. If we all work together, we can make sure that no one suffers from violence and bias anymore." His words had a tremendous impact, and the hall was filled with applause. Over time, even Officer Carter began to realize that his actions had not only ruined the lives of others, but his own as well. He also became part of the change process by beginning to actively participate in a rehabilitation program that helped him see himself and his actions from a new perspective. His personal journey of understanding and repentance became another part of a larger story of hope for the future. Shortly afterwards, a large fair was held in the city to celebrate unity and inclusion. Residents took to the streets with placards that spelled out their dreams for a fair and safe future for all. Jaden and his family were the center of attention, and as they approached the stage, the auditorium once again filled with applause. Alice, standing next to her son, gave a moving speech full of gratitude and hope. "We all deserve equality," she said, "but to do that, we need to work together to build a world where everyone feels safe and respected. We can and must create a future where no child is subjected to violence and prejudice just because of the color of his or her skin or physical condition." These words were the beginning of a new era for the city, and many believed that their story was only the beginning. The struggle for justice and equality continued, but now people had hope. Hope that change was possible if they worked together, supported each other, and strived for a better world for all. In this way, the story of Jaden, his mother Alice, and their community became a symbol that justice is not an end goal, but an ongoing process. They realized that unity and the active participation of each individual could bring about real change. Their hearts burned with hope for the future, and they were ready to move forward, knowing that every small victory could make a huge difference in their fight for justice. Thank you for your attention and for letting this story be a part of your day. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. See you again.